Hello, I'm Christine Chan from the Journal of Environmental Investing, and we're here at the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative Global Roundtable. We're here with Mr. Andrew Mitchell, who's the founder and executive director of the Global Canopy Programme, and he's going to talk to us about the valuation of natural capital, particularly as it applies to forests.
Well, I guess I've been about 40 years working in tropical forests as a zoologist and as a conservationist, doing my best to save them, and probably failing miserably because rainforests have been cut down at a very high rate and have been for decades. So the thing that interests me is how can we turn that around? How could we come up with a new paradigm for valuing tropical forests, which might change the way that this process to stop deforestation, and that's really what I've been working on.
Because the bottom line is their material value. I think that actually speaks to investors and to business people.
Well, the simple truth is that tropical forests are worth more dead than alive. What I mean by that is that you only really get a cash flow coming out of these forests when you cut them down and turn them into something else. So historically, this has in part been done by very poor people who live in the margins of these forests and cut them down for energy to cook food for their families. But more recently, over the last decade or 15 years or so, it's been large-scale agribusiness, converting forests for land to grow commodities such as beef and leather products, palm oil, biofuels, that sort of thing.
So you're trying to find incentives for companies to keep the forest alive.
Well, for governments, and of course, mostly for the local people who live and in some cases own these forests. Governments claim to own about 70% of these forests. So what you have to do is to create an economic framework where it makes more sense for them to keep those forests standing up than cutting them down.
All right, tell us about Red Plus, what it is, and what you hope to achieve.
Well, what has happened in the recent years is that the countries stood up in the international climate negotiations and basically said, look, if you want us to stop cutting down our forests, then you have to pay us because there's a big opportunity cost there that needs to be overcome. And one way to do that would be to pay countries that reduce the emissions that come out of forests when they're burned to those emissions which would be stopped from going into the atmosphere. Then under a future carbon market, you might be paid for that. And that became known as Red Plus, reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation. The emissions from forests are enormous. They're equal to almost the entire global transport sector, the emissions from that source. And that's caused mainly by, as I say, agribusiness and other causes converting these forests, and they get burnt in Southeast Asia, the emissions coming out of peatlands and so on, oxidizing when the forests are removed and the peatlands are drained, releases all this up into the atmosphere. So we really won't be able to solve the conundrum of climate change without also solving deforestation. So Red Plus is a means for countries to be paid through carbon markets. And there are very complex methodologies for doing that, measuring exactly how much carbon is not being released, and are the credits that come out of this real or not real, and are they permanent or not permanent, and these sorts of things have taken a long time through the negotiations. But Red Plus has become extraordinarily, just in 3 years, from being the least favorite thing in the negotiations to now being the most favorite thing for mitigating climate change between now and 2020.
So you're seeing a lot of interest in this type of from investors.
We're seeing a lot of interest from governments in how to set this up, a lot of interest in NGOs, some for, some against, and a lot of interest in the private sector in potentially seeing an opportunity to invest in forest credits. The problem is that the compliance market, which would make that happen, has been a very long time in coming. We're still waiting for these negotiations to deliver this compliance market. So what's happening is in the voluntary carbon market, forest credits are very popular. We're seeing almost 20% of the volume in that market being in forests, and just even in the last year it's gone up a lot. Whereas in the compliance market, which is the way to take that to scale, of course, it's less than 1%. So what we need is a compliance carbon market so that forest credits can get going. But that will require an agreement in Durban, and I don't think that's going to happen. That will require an agreement next year, at the end of 2012. No one's sure if the Kyoto Protocol is going to actually exist or not after that meeting. So there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and that's keeping the private sector from making major investments.
Right. Let's talk about an alternative then. Tell us about forest bonds.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that we've been looking at is how can you front-load finance to pay for the transition costs, because that's what the money is needed for, mainly for agriculture, to become sustainable. An awful lot of agricultural production is unsustainable. Forests are cut down, you have half a cow per hectare, and then the soy farmers who come after the cattle farmers clear out the last remains. You end up with a prairie, which requires a lot of fertilizer because the soil's not very good.
And heavy subsidies to begin with.
And heavy subsidies to make all this happen, which skews the pricing of these products. So they appear cheap when they're not really at all. And if you take into account the damage costs, they're extremely expensive. And these commodities get traded all over the world. So how do you pay these upfront costs to turn that around? And how do you bring in the private sector? There's quite a lot of government money flowing, but the amount of money that's needed to halve deforestation by 2020 is in the region of 17 to 33 billion a year. Now, no government is going to come up, particularly now, with that kind of money. But if you look at the global bond market, you're dealing with a market of $100 trillion. The amounts of money we need are relatively small. So that's a place to look. So this report, which we can hold up to people, you can sort of see, I don't know if you can read that, but it's called Unlocking Forest Bonds, is a report that we just published a couple of weeks ago, and it brought together private sector actors, government, NGOs, scientists to think, well, how could we use the bond market to save forests? And we came up with some pretty interesting ideas.
Great. Let's get back to the markets for a moment. In order to have a market in forest services, you need to have a price, and that leads us to the valuation of forest services. That sounds very challenging.
It's very challenging. Lots of people put very nice prices on these things, values rather, I should say, values. The TEEB review, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, have calculated that the value of forest ecosystem services that we are losing each year is somewhere between $1.5 to about $4 trillion a year in value. Now that's absolutely vast. A study done by TrueCost quite recently has suggested that the externalities that major companies are not including in the price of goods they sell are about $4 trillion a year. They're getting as Pavan Sukhdev said yesterday, a 4 trillion free lunch. Now, these numbers are useful to put a scale on things, but unless you can capture that value, they don't really help. So the challenge is how you can turn these sort of things into real money. Now, the carbon market was the first one to come on stream. But as we've heard, it's been slow in coming. Water is another possibility. But I think what we are looking at, and when we were talking about forest bonds, one of the big problems is how do you pay back the bond? And most of the people who've been looking at this have said, well, we'll use the carbon market, but there isn't one at scale. So that doesn't work. But what there are commodities, huge amounts of cash flow in the production of beef and soy and palm oil. So the trick is to twin the production of these commodities with saving the forest. And the other big pot of money that can be used are subsidies. Many of these subsidies are perverse, producing bad outcomes. What we need to do is shift those subsidies and incentivize good outcomes. So the kind of ingredients that come together with these bonds is to look at carbon as the cream on top, the big bet that might happen in the future, that the commodities, sustainable commodities production can produce enough cash flow which can be perhaps securitized over time and would produce payback to the bond, that we can use subsidies perhaps to help pay for insurance and other risk mitigation strategies. And these are the sorts of ingredients that we're all working on. Nobody really has an answer for this, but we're working with the right people to see if we can come up with one.
It sounds like you made some progress in codifying these ideas of natural values in a natural values declaration that you've launched here at the Finance Initiative. Tell us about the progress you've made in engaging stakeholders in looking at these values.
Well, one of the themes of the Rio Plus 20 Summit, which is coming up in June of 2012, is a roadmap to a green economy. And one of the things that you need to do in that roadmap is to take account of the externalities that I've been talking about that are not included in the price of things. Almost everything in the world is not priced correctly because of this $4 trillion free lunch. It ain't in the price.
Right.
So that gives us a false sense of what we're actually buying. So how do you do that? That's really difficult. But with the finance industry, we've been talking to them about, well, let's have a natural capital declaration where the finance industry would come together and say, look, we need to start reporting this. We need to develop a methodology for doing it. We should be taking account of natural capital when we're making decisions about equity and lending. So let's say that that's something we're going to do, and we're going to work on the methodologies to achieve that. But going further, we think companies should start doing the same thing on an annual basis, start reporting on their natural capital use, just like social and financial capital, which everybody reports on. We're forgetting about the natural capital, which is a huge part of wealth creation. And so companies should start doing that, and governments should start doing it. It turns out that there are two other initiatives moving in the same direction. For governments, the World Bank WAVES initiatives, which is wealth accounting, valuation of ecosystem services, and that's calling on governments to account for ecosystem services and natural capital on a national basis. India has signed up to that. The British government has too, and several others. Then the corporates are also saying, well, we should do the same, and there's an initiative for that. And then there's the one we're doing with the finance industry. So I see an opportunity to bring these things together at Rio and make a very powerful statement that is showing how the business world and hopefully governments and the finance world are all waking up to these obligations for the future. And that will put the third leg on the stool, that financial stool where we've been sitting on two legs for too long. And the financial crisis we have today will be dwarfed by the natural capital crisis of tomorrow unless we get a tree and stick it under that third leg of the stool to hold the economy up, the 21st century economy of the future.
Dire warning. Mr. Andrew Mitchell from the Global Canopy Programme, working to save the world's forests, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.